Lydia McAllister believed she had married salvation. It had a name. Reverend Silas McAllister, and a voice that could coax tears from stone and amens from the most stubborn of sinners. She had come from the green, orderly hills of Pennsylvania, a place of modest means and even more modest ambitions, and saw in him a pillar of righteousness who could lift her up, give her life purpose in the raw, godless expanse of the West. For 5 years, she had tried to be the woman he required, the silent, beatific partner to his thundering piety. From her place in the front pew, or more often standing just inside the vestry door, she watched him work his weekly magic. The church in the town of Redemption was a simple clapboard box, smelling of dry dust, pine lumber, and the faint, sour scent of sweat from the hard-working bodies packed inside. Sunlight thick with dancing motes, speared through the tall, plain glass windows, illuminating the congregation's faces. They were ranchers, miners, merchants, and their weary wives, all turned toward Silas, their expressions rapt and hungry. They saw a shepherd, a vessel of the divine word. Lydia saw the intricate machinery of the man. She saw the way he would pause for effect, his great barrel chest rising, his eyes sweeping the room to find the one soul wavering on the edge of conviction. He was a master of his craft. Behind the closed doors of the parsonage, the performance continued, but the audience was only her, and the part she played was that of the sinner in constant need of correction. Their intimacy was a barren landscape, a duty performed in the dark with grim determination on his part, and a hollowed-out resignation on hers. It was another sermon, delivered without words, about her inherent frailty. More frequent were the verbal rebukes. Her conversation with the blacksmith's wife had been too familiar. The neckline on her Sunday dress, a dress he had chosen, was a whisper too low, an invitation to sin. She was to keep her eyes downcast, her voice soft, her presence a mere shadow that proved his light was all the more brilliant. He called it molding her spirit, chipping away the worldly flaws to reveal the pious wife beneath. To Lydia, it felt like being put in a box that grew smaller each day. Her only escape was the view from the small kitchen window. Beyond the dusty street and the last struggling buildings of Redemption lay the true cathedral. The land rolled out in waves of ochre and sage green, stretching to the feet of mountains that clawed at the vast, empty sky. It was a harsh, unforgiving country of thorny scrub, sudden canyons, and relentless sun, but it possessed a wild, honest beauty that Lydia's soul craved. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was, in its unforgiving honesty. She saw a kind of freedom she could barely remember. A memory would sometimes surface, unbidden, of herself as a girl, her hair unbound, running through a Pennsylvania meadow with grass stains on her knees. The feeling of it, the simple, uncomplicated joy, was so alien now it felt like a dream belonging to someone else. The girl in the meadow was a stranger, and Lydia mourned her. The breaking point arrived on a Sunday hotter than the devil's forge. The air in the church was thick enough to drink, and Silas was in rare form, his sermon a blistering tirade against the temptations of the flesh. His eyes seemed to burn, and his voice cracked with manufactured passion. Lydia stood by the vestry, feeling a familiar wave of faintness, when a voice cut through the reverent silence that followed his final, booming prayer. It was Martha Gable, the baker's wife, a woman whose piety was as sharp and thin as a shard of glass. She stood up, her face a mask of righteous indignation. "Reverend," she called out, her voice trembling but loud, "before we give our final thanks, there is a rot in this house that must be addressed." A murmur went through the congregation. Silas, caught off guard, lowered his hands from their prayerful peak. "Sister Martha, what troubles you?" Martha's finger, bony and accusatory, shot out and pointed directly at Lydia. Your wife, I saw her with my own eyes, speaking in whispers with Jebediah from the choir, behind the livery stable, laughing, their heads so close. It is an affront to this holy house and to you, our shepherd." The air was sucked from the church, Every head swiveled toward Lydia. She felt 100 pairs of eyes land on her like stones. Her face burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. The accusation was a lie, a vicious twisting of a simple moment when Jebediah had asked her advice on a gift for his ailing mother. But the truth was a feather against the hurricane of Martha's malice. She was aiming for Silas, of course, seeking to tarnish his perfect reputation through his wife. But it was Lydia who would bear the wound. Silas's face went from shock to a deep, dangerous crimson. He descended from the pulpit in 3 long strides, his boots echoing like hammer blows. He seized Lydia's upper arm, his fingers digging in like talons. "Is this true?" he roared, his voice no longer a shepherd's call but a predator's snarl. He dragged her from the shadows of the vestry into the unforgiving light in front of the altar. "Did you disgrace my name? Did you bring your filth into my ministry?" "No," Lydia whispered, her voice lost in the cavern of the church. "Silas, it was not like that." "Do not lie to me in the Lord's own house." He shook her, a quick, violent jerk that rattled her teeth. In front of everyone, in front of the faces that had looked to her as the paragon of virtue. He held her as a common criminal. The shame was a physical blow, more painful than any strike. She saw no sympathy in the crowd, only judgment, a grim satisfaction in seeing the angel fall. They had their proof now that no one was beyond sin, least of all the preacher's wife. That night, the church was no sanctuary. It was a tomb, lit by a single flickering lantern on the altar. Silas had bound her hands loosely before him, the rope chafing her wrists. He paced back and forth, his shadow a monstrous, dancing giant on the walls. "Your weakness has given my enemies a weapon," he hissed, his voice a low, venomous whisper. "They will use this to tear down everything I have built. You are a viper I have warmed at my hearth." It was a lie. "Silas, Martha hates that you did not choose her daughter to lead the choir." He stopped and slapped the pulpit, the sound cracking through the silence. "The truth does not matter. Perception is truth here, and you, my dear wife, are now perceived as a harlot." He leaned close, his breath sour with stale coffee and fury. "You will remain silent. You will confess to nothing and deny nothing. You will be a ghost in my house. If you speak a word of this to anyone, if you try to explain or defend yourself, I will cast you out. And out here," he gestured vaguely toward the dark windows. "A woman alone, a disgraced preacher's wife, has few prospects. They will call you a witch. They will drive you into the desert to perish." "Am I understood?" Lydia looked at the man she had once thought was her salvation and saw only a jailer. The choice was clear. She could stay and suffocate, her soul withering to dust under his righteous tyranny, or she could run. The wilderness that had once seemed so threatening now looked like a promise. It might kill her, but it would not put her in a cage. She nodded meekly. "Yes, Silas, I understand." He seemed satisfied, untying her wrists with a final, contemptuous tug. "Go to the parsonage. Pray for the Lord to forgive your foolishness." But as Lydia walked on trembling legs from the church, she was not praying for forgiveness. She was planning. A sliver of hope came in the form of Sarah, a quiet widow whose kindness was a small, steady flame in the cold draft of the church. Lydia found her mending clothes by lamplight in her small cottage. Without a word, Sarah seemed to understand. Her gentle eyes took in Lydia's pale face and the faint red marks on her wrists. She listened to the hurried, whispered story, her expression hardening with a quiet anger Lydia had never seen in her before. "He is a monster wrapped in scripture," Sarah said, her voice firm. She rose and gathered a small bundle from her pantry, a block of hard cheese, a handful of dried apples, and a small, full water skin. "This is not much, but it is a start." She pressed a worn leather pouch into Lydia's hand. "A few coins. Go west, toward the Sentinel Peaks. There is a pass. It is a hard climb, but fewer men travel that way. Follow the stars." Put as much distance between you and this town as you can before sunup." Lydia looked at her friend, her heart aching with gratitude. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I know what it is to feel trapped," Sarah said simply. "Now go, and do not look back." She saw Reverend Baxter on her way back to the parsonage. He was locking the church doors for the night. He saw her, and for a moment, his face held a look of profound pity. He started to speak, then stopped, his eyes darting around the empty street. He gave her a short, helpless nod and turned away. The jangle of his keys, a final, damning sound of the town's complicity. He was a good man, perhaps, but his goodness was no match for his fear. She was truly alone. Back in the small, stifling bedroom she shared with Silas, she moved with silent purpose. She packed a small canvas satchel, a change of underthings, her mother's silver locket, a sturdy knife from the kitchen, and Sarah's provisions. She slipped on her most durable walking shoes and pulled a dark shawl over her head. Silas was in his study, likely reading his Bible, searching for verses to justify his cruelty. The back door of the parsonage creaked, a sound as loud as a gunshot in the still night. Lydia froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Silence. She slipped out into the yard and kept to the shadows, her path taking her behind the church and toward the edge of town. The wild land met her with a blast of cold, dry air that smelled of dust and distant rain. The moon was a pale, broken thing, offering little light. The ground was uneven, studded with sharp rocks and thorny bushes that plucked at the hem of her skirt. In the distance, a coyote yelped, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed the fear in her own heart. The wind picked up, a low moan that whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it the grit of the desert. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every sound a pursuer. But with each step she took away from the town of redemption, a new feeling began to take root in the barren soil of her soul. It was a terrifying, exhilarating thing. It was freedom, under the dim, watchful eyes of the stars. Lydia McAllister walked into the vast, dangerous, and beautiful dark, leaving her cage behind forever. The wilderness was a far crueler master than Silas had ever been. It did not scold or preach. It simply stripped away everything but the raw, aching need for survival. For 3 days, Lydia had been a ghost moving through a landscape of rock and thorn. The cheese and apples from Sarah were long gone, and the water skin was a light, mocking reminder of her thirst. Her lips were cracked, her tongue thick in her mouth. The hope that had fueled her first night of flight had dwindled to a tiny, guttering ember, starved of the oxygen of faith. She mumbled the old prayers from habit, the words dry and meaningless on her tongue. It felt like speaking into an empty room. The God of redemption had no jurisdiction here. Here, there was only the sun, the wind, and the vast, indifferent silence. Exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making each step an act of will. She stumbled often, her city shoes torn and useless against the sharp stones. By the third night, she found a shallow overhang of rock to shelter her from the wind, curling into a tight ball for warmth as the temperature plummeted with the setting sun. Sleep was a shallow, troubled thing, filled with images of Silas's furious face and the accusing eyes of the congregation. It was the sound that woke her, a rhythmic crunching, too steady for a deer or coyote, hoofbeats on stone. Her heart seized in her chest, a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. They had found her. Silas had sent men. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the overhang, making herself small, willing the rock to swallow her whole. The sound grew closer, slow and deliberate. It was not the sound of a posse, she realized, but of a single horse, picking its way carefully up the rugged incline. A figure emerged into the pale moonlight, a silhouette of a man on horseback. He was tall, even-seated, with broad shoulders that spoke of strength. He reined his horse to a halt not 20 yards from her hiding place, the animal blowing out a weary sigh. The man dismounted, his movements fluid but tired. He pulled a folded paper from his saddlebag and knelt, trying to read it in the poor light. A map. He grunted in frustration. Then his head came up, his gaze sweeping the ground around him. He had seen her tracks, even in her exhaustion. She had not thought to hide them. He stood slowly, his hand resting not on the pistol holstered at his hip, but on his thigh. His posture was wary, not aggressive. "Anyone there?" he called out, his voice low and raspy. Not a shout, but a question meant to carry on the still night air. Lydia held her breath, her muscles locked and rigid. She was a stone, a shadow. "Nothing?" The man waited a long moment, his head cocked. He seemed to shrug, a barely perceptible movement, and turned back to his horse. He swung himself up into the saddle. He was leaving. Relief, so potent it almost made her gasp, washed over her. But as his horse shifted its weight to turn, its movement dislodged a small pebble that rolled and clattered down the rock face near her. The man's head snapped back. His eyes, accustomed to the dark, scanned the rocks again, and this time they found her. He saw not a woman, but a flicker of movement, a pair of wide, terrified eyes staring out from the absolute blackness of the overhang. They stared at each other for a few seconds that stretched into an eternity. Lydia's survival instinct screamed at her to run, to scramble away into the darkness. She tensed, ready to bolt. "Wait," he said. The word was not a command, but a plea. It was quiet, yet it stopped her as surely as a rope. She remained frozen as he swung down from his horse again. He did not draw his weapon. He kept his hands open and visible at his sides and approached with a slow, measured pace, as if gentling a spooked animal. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for her to see the exhaustion etched on his face, the dark stubble on his jaw, and the weariness in his dark eyes. He looked as hunted as she felt. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, his voice still low and even. "But a woman alone out here. You are either running from something, or you are lost. If you are running, you must have a reason." The gentleness of his tone was her undoing. It was so unlike the harsh thunder of her husband's voice that it broke through the wall of her fear. A dry, ragged sob escaped her throat. She could not form a lie. The sheer weight of her despair was too heavy. I could not live like that anymore," she whispered, the words tearing at her raw throat. The man's expression softened with something that looked like understanding. He nodded slowly. "That is a good enough reason." He glanced around at the unforgiving landscape. "You will not last another night out here. I have a cabin, not far. It is not much, but it is warm, and there is water." He paused. "You can come with me, or you can stay here. It is your choice." She looked from his face to the endless, hostile darkness stretching out behind him. To stay was to die. To go with him was a risk, but it was a risk that held the promise of water, of warmth. It was the only choice she had. She gave a single, jerky nod. He led her to his horse, a big, steady bay that watched her with intelligent eyes. He helped her mount, his hand strong and impersonal on her waist, and then swung up behind her. The heat from his body was a shock, a profound comfort against the cold that had settled deep in her bones. They rode in silence. The only sound, the steady plod of the horse's hooves and the sigh of the wind through the sparse, twisted pines that grew at this higher elevation. The town of Redemption had not slept easy since the preacher's wife had vanished. A serving girl had seen a shadow flitting from the back of the parsonage, and by morning, the news was a wildfire. Reverend Silas McAllister had stood before his congregation, his face a tragic mask, and spoken of his wife's fragile mind, of her being led astray by a moment of weakness. He asked for their prayers, but in the back room of the saloon, he did not ask for prayers. He laid a heavy purse of coins on a stained table before a man with cold eyes and a notched gun belt. The bounty hunter's name was Jedediah Stone, and he had a reputation for finding people who did not want to be found. Silas wanted his property returned, and he would pay any price to see it done. The man she rode with, Caleb Raines, or Cal as he called himself, did not offer much in the way of conversation. He pointed out the faint outline of the cabin as they approached. A dark shape nestled in a stand of tall ponderosa pines. Patches of old snow lay in the shadows, remnants of a late spring storm. The air grew colder, cleaner. The wind was a different sound up here, a high, lonely hiss as it moved through the pine needles. It was a beautiful place, but a desolate one, a place to hide. The cabin was small and rough-hewn, but the door was solid and the chimney sent a thin curl of smoke into the night sky. Inside, a low fire glowed in a stone hearth. The space was sparse and immaculately clean. A bedroll in one corner, a small table with one chair, shelves holding a few tins of food, and a rifle leaning against the wall. It was the home of a man who traveled light and expected to leave at a moment's notice. Cal helped her down and immediately went to the fire. Adding a log, "Sit," he said, gesturing to the floor near the hearth. He ladled water from a bucket into a tin cup and warmed it by the flames before handing it to her. Lydia drank it greedily, the warm liquid a balm to her parched throat. He gave her a piece of hardtack and a strip of jerky, and she had never tasted anything so fine. He noticed the bloody scrape on her hand where she had fallen earlier. Without a word, he took a clean rag from his pack, dampened it, and gently cleaned the wound. His touch was careful, practical. He worked with a quiet focus, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was the first act of simple, uncomplicated kindness a man had shown her in 5 years. She felt a dangerous prickle of tears behind her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. She could not afford to be weak, not now. "You are running from your husband," he said. It was not a question. She nodded, her mouth full of jerky. "He will send men," Cal stated, his eyes on the fire. "A man like that, a preacher. His pride is all he has. He cannot let you just walk away. It makes him look weak." "How would you know what kind of man he is?" she asked, her old suspicion flaring. Cal looked at her then, and his eyes held a deep, ancient sadness. "I have known a lot of men. Most of them are not as different as they think they are." He looked away again. "I should not have brought you here. I'm trying to avoid trouble." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Seems I am not very good at it." "Who are you?" Lydia asked, her voice barely a whisper. He was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames as if reading a story there. "My name is Cal, and I used to be a gunslinger. Got into a dispute over some land. A man died. It was a fair fight, but he had powerful friends. They put a price on my head. I have been moving ever since, trying to find a place where my past will not come looking for me." He finally met her gaze. "Getting involved with you. It is a risk. For both of us." The confession hung in the air between them. He was a fugitive, just like her. They were two sides of the same tarnished coin. Lydia wrestled with the new information. She had fled a man of God only to be rescued by a man of the gun. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. Could she trust him? What choice did she have to depend on another man? Felt like a betrayal of her newfound freedom. Yet she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would not have survived another day alone. Cal seemed to be having his own internal battle. He rose and walked to the single small window, peering out into the blackness. The wind howled, rattling the wooden shutters. He was a man who wanted to be left alone, who had good reason to turn his back on a woman who was dragging a storm of trouble behind her. And yet, he had not. He had stopped. He had brought her here. "You can rest here for the night," he said, his back still to her. "In the morning, we can decide what to do next." He laid his own bedroll out for her near the fire and took a coarse blanket for himself. Settling in the corner farthest from her, by the door, with his rifle close at hand. It was a protective gesture. She realized he was sleeping between her and whatever might come through that door. Lydia lay down on the soft furs of the bedroll, every muscle in her body screaming with a pain that was also a kind of release. She was no longer running, For a few hours, at least. She was safe. She stared at the rough log ceiling, listening to the crackle of the fire and the lonely cry of the wind outside. A sliver of hope, fragile and pale as the moon, began to push its way through the fear. But the fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. What would morning bring, and what new dangers lay waiting for her in the vast, unknown wilderness ahead? The first few days in the cabin were a period of slow resurrection. Sleep, deep and dreamless, began to knit together the frayed edges of Lydia's exhaustion. The steady supply of clean, cold water from a nearby spring washed the desert from her throat, and the simple food Cal provided started to rebuild her strength. For the first time in 5 years, she was not beholden to a bell calling her to prayer or a timetable of domestic duties dictated by another. The hours were her own, and the quiet was a profound luxury. She began by exploring the small world around the cabin. She learned the path to the spring, her feet growing accustomed to the uneven ground. She found a patch of wild berries, tasting them cautiously at first, then gathering them in the hem of her skirt with a child's delight. She was a student in a new, vast schoolhouse, and her teacher was a man of few words and infinite patience. Cal started her education with a knife. He showed her how to carve a feather stick for kindling, how to clean a rabbit he had snared, how to notch a piece of wood. Her hands, accustomed to needlepoint and kneading dough, were clumsy. The blade felt alien and dangerous. On the second day of her lesson, her concentration slipped, and the knife skittered across a piece of pine, laying open a thin red line on her thumb, the sight of her own blood. Combined with the sting and the frustration, brought a sudden, hot rush of tears to her eyes. She gasped, more in shame at her weakness than in pain. In redemption, such a display would have earned her a lecture from Silas on the sin of impatience. She expected a sharp word from Cal, a sigh of exasperation. Instead, he simply took the knife from her hand and set it aside. He gently took her hand in his calloused fingers surprisingly tender, and examined the cut. "It is not deep," he said, his voice low. He guided her inside, washed the cut with water from the bucket, and bound it neatly with a strip of clean cloth from his pack. He did it all without judgment, his movements economical and sure. The quiet care of the gesture disarmed her completely. She did not cry, but she felt the hard knot of tension she had carried for years loosen just a little. He taught her other things, how to walk through the woods without sounding like a spooked buffalo. He would point to the ground, showing her the difference between the track of a deer and a coyote, the meaning of a broken twig or a patch of disturbed earth. He taught her the currency of silence, the importance of listening to the forest's language, the sharp warning cry of a jay, the rustle of leaves that was not made by the wind. In the evenings, by the low light of the fire, they sometimes talked. The conversations were hesitant, like two people feeling their way across a dark room. They did not speak of the future. It was too vast and uncertain a territory. Instead, they carefully unspooled small threads of their pasts. Lydia spoke of the church, of the immense pressure to be perfect, a porcelain doll on Silas's shelf. She did not speak of his hands on her, or the coldness in their bed. But Cal seemed to hear the words she did not say. He listened with an unwavering stillness, his eyes on the fire, and when she was done, he would simply nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that was more comforting than a dozen empty platitudes. In turn, he told her a little more about the land dispute. He spoke of a wife and a young son, not by name, but as figures in a life that no longer existed. "The man I shot, his brother was the law in that county," Cal said one night, his voice a low rumble. "They would not have called it a fair fight. They would have called it murder. I saw the look in my wife's eyes when she saw the posse forming. It was fear. For me. For our boy. So I left. I thought they would be safer without me." He fell silent, and Lydia knew from the hard line of his jaw that the story did not have a happy ending. He had lost them, not just by leaving, but in a more final way he was not yet ready to share. They were two people defined by their losses, and in that shared emptiness, a fragile trust began to grow. The feeling between them shifted one afternoon as the sun began to bleed across the western peaks, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet. Cal led his horse, a calm gelding named Pilgrim, from its small lean-to. "You need to learn to ride," he said. "If we have to leave in a hurry, you cannot slow us down." His logic was sound, but the sight of the large animal made Lydia's stomach flutter. She had only ever ridden in a slow, steady buggy. He helped her up, his hands circling her waist to lift her onto the saddle blanket. She felt a jolt at his touch, a warmth that spread through her. She was unsteady, and he stood close, one hand on her back, the other on the horse's neck. "Just feel his rhythm," Cal said, his voice close to her ear. "He will not hurt you. Move with him." He led Pilgrim in a slow circle. Lydia was rigid with fear, her hands clutching the horse's mane. She could feel the solid wall of Cal's chest behind her, hear the steady, slow beat of his heart. The sound was deeply calming. She focused on it, on the warmth of his hand on her back, and slowly, her own racing heart began to slow. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and her body relaxed, sinking into the horse's movement. The world looked different from up here, wider and full of possibility. The quiet moment, with the setting sun warming their faces and the vast, silent mountains as their only witness, was more intimate than any touch she had ever known. The sanctuary was shattered a few mornings later. Cal had ridden out at dawn to check his snare lines, and Lydia, feeling a new surge of confidence, decided to gather more of the berries she had found. She ventured farther than usual, following the thickest patches, her mind wandering. It was not until she was on her way back that she realized she had walked through a large patch of damp, muddy earth near the spring, leaving a clear set of footprints from her worn, city-made shoes. When Cal returned, he did not even need to dismount to see the tracks. His body went still in the saddle, his eyes narrowing. He looked from the prints to her, his face a grim mask. "Someone has been close," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Those are mine," Lydia said, her own voice small, the confidence of the morning evaporating. "I am so sorry. Cal, I was not thinking." He swung down from Pilgrim, his expression unreadable. "It is not your fault. It is mine. I should have warned you." He did not waste time on recriminations. He knelt and studied the ground around her footprints. "Get inside," he said, and there was a new edge to his voice. He followed her a moment later. After leading Pilgrim into the cover of the pines, he began to circle the cabin, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes scanning every detail. Lydia watched him from the doorway, her heart a cold stone in her chest. He stopped, crouching near a thicket of brush about 50 yards from the cabin door. When he stood up, he was holding something small and metallic in his palm, a spent rifle cartridge. "They were watching," he said, his voice grim. "Waiting." He showed her the scuffed patch of leaves, the single, deeper print of a boot heel where a man had braced himself to take aim. The reality of it, the cold, calculated patience of their unseen enemy, was terrifying. Cal's reaction was immediate. He went inside and began to pack his few belongings into his saddlebags. A bag of coffee, a tin of beans, his spare ammunition. His movements were swift and efficient. He was a man accustomed to sudden departures. "We leave now," he said, not looking at her. "We will head north, into the high country. It will be harder going, but they will not expect it." Lydia watched him, her mind reeling. Run again, hide again, live in fear of every sound, every shadow. The thought was suffocating. The girl who had fled redemption 3 weeks ago would have agreed without question. But that girl was gone. A new woman was standing in her place. A woman who had felt the sun on her face and learned the weight of a knife in her hand. "No," she said. Cal stopped packing and turned to face her. "No, I will not run forever," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I have spent my whole life being quiet and afraid and doing as I was told. I am done running." She took a deep breath. "If I must fight, then I will learn to fight." He stared at her, a strange expression on his face. It was a mixture of alarm, disbelief, and something else she could not quite name, something that looked like respect. He saw the fierce determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw, and he knew she meant it. The thought of putting her in the path of men like Jedediah Stone made his blood run cold, but he also recognized the steel that had been forged in her during these last few weeks. To force her to run now would be to break the very spirit he had watched come back to life. That night, the mood in the cabin was tense and quiet. Lydia made a simple porridge over the fire, a poor, watery gruel, but it was warm. Cal had trouble getting the damp kindling to catch, and when he finally coaxed a flame, his hands were black with soot. As he sat back on his heels, Lydia took a damp cloth and, without thinking, reached out and gently wiped the grime from his fingers. It was an awkward, hesitant gesture, but he let her do it. Their eyes met over the small fire, and for the first time, a real, unguarded smile touched his lips. Lydia felt her own lips curve in response, a small, shared moment of normalcy in a world that had become anything but. Later, while he was outside checking on the horse, Lydia noticed a pair of old, scarred leather gloves lying on a shelf. They were Cal's. She picked them up. The leather was stiff and worn smooth in places, stained dark with sweat and oil. She slipped one on. It was huge on her hand, a hollow shell that still held the shape of his strength. She traced the deep scratches and scuffs with her finger. Each mark was a story. A mile traveled, a danger faced. Each scar, she thought, was a lesson. She put the glove back on the shelf just as he came back inside, a cold draft of night air swirling in with him. He saw her standing by the porch door, staring out into the darkness where a few fat snowflakes had begun to drift down, melting as they touched the ground. He came and stood behind her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He did not touch her, but he shifted his position slightly, his large frame blocking the draft that seeped through the cracks in the door. He was shielding her from the cold. Lydia shivered, though not from the cold. She could feel his gaze on her, and she turned her head to look up at him. Their faces were only inches apart. His eyes, in the dim firelight, were dark and intense, filled with 1,000 unspoken things. Worry, resignation, and a deep, aching tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. The silence stretched, filled with the soft hiss of the falling snow and the steady beat of her own heart. The truce was over. They both knew it. The real trial, the one they could not run from, was no longer a distant threat. It was here, now, waiting for them in the gathering dark. The fragile piece was a soap bubble, shimmering and beautiful for a moment before it vanished. Cal saw it happen from the edge of the clearing. He stood as still as the pines around him, his body a study in tension, and watched a spot far down the opposing slope. It was nothing more than a flicker of movement, a disruption in the pattern of the trees that a lesser eye would have missed. But Cal's eye was not lesser. It was the eye of a man who had survived by seeing what others did not. He saw the dark shape of a man, then another, moving with purpose through the timber. They were too far to be a threat yet, but they were coming. The hunt was on. He returned to the cabin not with haste, but with a chilling deliberation. "They are on the mountain," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "2 of them, maybe more." Lydia was stirring a thin broth over the fire, and she froze, the wooden spoon still in her hand. Fear, cold and familiar, washed over her. But then another feeling rose to meet it, the stubborn anger she had found within herself. "What do? We wait for dark," he said, checking his rifle. the metallic click of the action unnervingly loud in the small space. "I will go out, see how close they are, what we are up against." "I will come with you," Lydia said. It was not a request. Cal looked up from his rifle, his dark eyes searching hers. He saw the fear, but he also saw the resolve that refused to be cowed by it. He started to object, to tell her it was too dangerous, that her place was here where it was safe. But he stopped. The cabin was not safe. There was no safe place left. And she had already told him she was through with being sheltered. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Stay behind me. Make no sound. Do exactly as I say." As dusk settled, a cold, wet mist began to creep down from the peaks, evolving into a light, sleeting snow. It was a miserable shroud, but it was also cover. They slipped out of the cabin like ghosts, melting into the deeper shadows of the forest. Cal moved with a liquid grace, his feet seeming to know where every silent patch of pine needles lay. Lydia followed, trying to mimic his movements. Her senses stretched to their breaking point. Every snap of a twig, every sigh of the wind sounded like the approach of an enemy. They followed a narrow game trail that skirted the edge of a steep ravine. The ground was slick with wet leaves and patches of icy mud. Cal paused, holding up a hand, and pointed down into the gloom. A faint, orange glow flickered for a moment. A campfire. They were closer than he had thought, much closer. He motioned for her to retreat, and they began to move back the way they had come, their steps even more cautious than before. They were crossing a patch of marshy meadowland when it happened. Lydia, concentrating on placing her feet as silently as possible, stepped on a moss-covered rock. It tilted under her weight, slick as greased glass. Her foot shot out from under her, and she pitched forward with a startled cry she could not suppress. She fell not cleanly, but in a chaotic, dragging tangle of limbs and clothing. Her skirt caught on the jagged branch of a deadfall, the fabric ripping with a harsh, tearing sound. She tumbled into the muddy, half-frozen grass, her momentum carrying her in an undignified heap. When she came to a stop, breathless and stunned, she was a mess of mud and torn cloth. The fall had been so violent it had ripped not only her skirt, but the simple cotton drawers she wore beneath, pulling them down around her ankles. For a moment, she just lay there, the cold mud seeping through her remaining clothes, the sheer shock of it all paralyzing her. Cal heard the cry and the crash and was at her side in an instant, his pistol in his hand, his body crouched low. He saw her lying in a heap, and then his eyes took in the full, disastrous picture, the pale skin of her legs stark against the dark mud, the white tangle of her ruined underthings. His hunter's focus shattered. All he could see was her, exposed and utterly vulnerable in the heart of the wilderness, with killers somewhere in the trees nearby. The words came out of him in a choked, disbelieving whisper, more to himself than to her. She dropped her drawers in the dust. He took a ragged breath, the immense, terrifying absurdity of their situation crashing down on him. He looked from her tangled form to the dark, menacing woods around them, and then back to her. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed, the words a prayer and a curse all in one. "You are trouble." A hot wave of shame and anger washed through Lydia, powerful enough to overcome the shock. She scrambled to sit up, fumbling to pull the torn pieces of her skirt and drawers over herself, her face burning with a humiliation that felt hotter than any fire. A rock was slippery. She hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of embarrassment and fury at her own body for betraying her. For a heartbeat, Cal's composure broke. A low chuckle escaped him, a sound of pure, astonished disbelief. It was a dangerous sound, but it was also human, and it broke the spell of her mortification. Then, just as quickly, he was serious again, his eyes scanning the darkness around them. "Be careful," he whispered, his voice urgent. "Did anyone see? Did they hear?" They listened, their breath held, but there was only the sound of the wind and the soft patter of sleet on the leaves. He helped her to her feet. She was favoring her leg, a sharp pain shooting up from her knee where she had landed on a stone. The brief moment of levity was gone, replaced by the cold, hard reality of their predicament. They were exposed, and she was injured. As they drew near the cabin, a new and unsettling sight met their eyes. A thin, almost invisible tendril of smoke was rising from the chimney. It was not the healthy plume of a well-tended fire, but the ghost of one that had been recently scattered. Cal put a hand on Lydia's arm, stopping her. His face was a granite slab in the gloom. Someone had been inside. Someone had been there, and had left. They circled the cabin, using the trees for cover. The front door, which Cal had barred, was slightly ajar. They had forced it, moving with a predator's silence. Cal slipped through the opening, his pistol raised. Lydia followed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The inside was a scene of quiet violation. Their meager belongings had been tossed and searched. The bedding was thrown on the floor, the food tins pried open and discarded. The embers of their fire had been kicked from the hearth, sending ash and soot across the floorboards. It was a search done with contemptuous haste. Then Lydia saw a splintered, ugly hole in the log wall just above where she had been sleeping. A bullet hole. They had not just searched, they had left a message. "We have to go," Cal said, his voice a low growl. There was no room for discussion. The cabin was a trap now. They worked quickly, salvaging what they could. He grabbed his remaining ammunition and shoved the last of the jerky and hardtack into his saddlebags. Lydia found a spare blanket that had been overlooked in the chaos. The sleet outside was turning into a driving, freezing rain, and the wind had risen to a howl. Lydia's knee throbbed with a deep, insistent ache, and each step was a fresh agony. She tried not to limp, not to slow him down, but the pain was a persistent thief, stealing her strength. Cal saw her falter and, without a word, moved to her side, putting his arm around her waist to support her weight. The warmth of his body was a small anchor in the storm, but she felt a fresh wave of self-loathing. She was a liability. She had insisted on coming. She had been clumsy, and now she was injured. She had brought this danger to this man who had only shown her kindness. "This is my fault," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "I should have stayed. I am a burden to you." Cal stopped and turned her to face him, his hands gripping her shoulders. The rain dripped from the brim of his hat, and his face was a grim shadow, but his eyes were fierce. "No," he said, his voice cutting through the noise of the storm. "This is not your fault. This is their fault. The men who are hunting you, the man who sent them, this is on them. I will not let anyone harm you. Lydia, do you hear me?" She heard him, but as she looked into his determined face, she saw the worry behind the certainty. He was one man, and he was taking on her past and his own. She nodded, unable to speak, and they pushed on into the maelstrom. The forest was a terrifying labyrinth of black, grasping shapes in unseen pitfalls. The freezing rain soaked them to the bone. They had to choose press on through the night, risking a fall in the treacherous dark, or try to find shelter and wait for morning, giving their pursuers time to find their trail. "We keep moving," Lydia said, her teeth chattering. "If we stop, they will corner us by sunrise." It was her will that drove them now. Cal, navigating by some unseen instinct, found a place that offered meager respite. It was a deep fissure in a massive rock outcropping, a narrow space barely wide enough for the two of them, sheltered from the worst of the wind and rain. It was not a cave, just a crack in the world. They huddled together in the absolute darkness, the cold a living thing that sought to devour them. Lydia began to shiver violently, her body racked with tremors she could not control. The cold was too deep. Without a word, Cal pulled her against him, wrapping his arms and the single dry blanket around her, trying to force the warmth of his own body into hers. His hand rested on her back, a firm, steady pressure. It was a gesture of pure survival, devoid of romance, yet it was the most profoundly intimate moment of her life. She pressed her face against the rough wool of his coat, taking in the scent of rain, pine, and him, in the cold, wet dark, surrounded by enemies. She was not alone. For a long while, they stayed like that, a single knot of shared warmth against the storm, but they both knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The men with the campfire were still out there. Silas's rage was still reaching for her. The night was far from over, and their enemies were getting closer with every gust of wind. They had to keep moving. The dawn was a reluctant gray smear in the east, revealing a world washed clean and brutal. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with a bone-deep chill. Lydia and Cal emerged from the fissure in the rock like creatures born from the earth, stiff, soaked, and utterly exhausted. The first rays of light showed the tracks almost immediately. 2 sets of boot prints, clear as day in the damp soil, moving with a hunter's purpose. Their pursuers had not been thrown off by the storm. They were close. Cal's face was a mask of grim calculation. Running blindly was no longer an option. They were tired. Lydia was injured, and their enemies were fresh. "We cannot outrun them," he said, his voice a low rasp. "So we make them come to us, on our terms." He led her not away from the tracks, but parallel to them, moving toward a dense stand of aspen and tangled undergrowth. He was looking for something, his eyes sweeping the terrain with a professional's appraisal. He found it in a narrow, rocky defile, a natural choke point where the game trail squeezed between a sheer rock face and a thicket of thorny bushes. "Here," he said. He began to work with a quiet, deadly efficiency, using his knife to partially sever the base of a dead, leaning tree so that a strong push would send it crashing down to block the path. He wove fallen branches into the bushes, creating a nearly invisible barrier that would force anyone following the trail directly into their line of sight. He was not building a fortress, but an ambush. As he was wedging a large rock into place, the sound cracked through the morning stillness. A single gunshot, sharp and clear. It was not close, but it was not far either. It was the sound of a man testing his weapon, ensuring his powder was dry after the night's rain. It was a signal of their imminent arrival. A tremor went through Lydia. Cal saw it and put a hand on her shoulder. "Get down," he whispered, his voice urgent. "Behind that log, lie flat and do not move, no matter what you hear." She scrambled behind a massive fallen pine, the damp bark pressing against her cheek, her heart a frantic drum against the forest floor. She lay there, listening, every nerve screaming. The woods fell into a profound silence. Even the birds seemed to be holding their breath. It felt like an eternity, but it was likely only minutes before a figure appeared at the far end of the defile. He was a big man, bearded and wearing a heavy buffalo coat despite the chill. He moved with a lazy confidence, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He was a tracker, and he was good. His eyes were on the ground, following their trail. He entered the narrowest part of the path, his eyes still down. Cal rose from his hiding place, a silent, dark shape against the rocks. He did not aim for the man. He aimed for a spot on the rock wall 2 feet to the man's left. The rifle's report was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet shrieked off the rock, sending a spray of stone chips whining through the air. The big man yelled in shock and surprise, diving for cover, his confidence shattered. He had been a hunter one moment, and the prey the next. He fired a single and wild shot back into the trees before scrambling back the way he had come. A panicked retreat. Cal did not wait to see more. He grabbed Lydia's hand, pulling her to her feet. "Come on, that bought us time, nothing more." He dragged her away from the trail, onto a path that did not exist. He led her on a punishing route that seemed designed to break a pursuer's will. They scrambled up steep, scree-covered slopes and slid down muddy embankments. He forced them through a patch of woods so thick with young pines that their branches whipped at their faces and tore at their clothes. Their destination was a shallow, fast-moving stream, its water achingly cold. "We have to cross," he said. "It will hide our tracks for a while." The icy water was a shock, stealing Lydia's breath and sending daggers of pain into her injured knee. She cried out as she put weight on it, nearly falling. Cal wrapped a strong arm around her, taking most of her weight, and half carried, half dragged her to the other side. They collapsed on the far bank, shivering and gasping. They rested for only a few minutes before pushing on, climbing higher into the foothills of the peaks. By late afternoon, they were all but spent. It was Lydia who spotted the cave, a dark slash in a rock face, partially hidden by a curtain of ancient, gnarled roots. It was small and shallow, but it was dry and out of the wind. Inside, Cal managed to coax a small, nearly smokeless fire from a handful of dry twigs he found deep within the cave. The warmth was a blessing, slowly chasing the chill from their bones. As the meager firelight flickered, illuminating their exhausted faces, Lydia finally said what had been burning in her mind all day. "I do not want to be a bird with a broken wing anymore. Cal, I do not want you to just protect me. I want to participate." He looked at her, his face weary. He knew what she was asking, and the thought of it made him deeply uneasy. He had seen what bullets did to people. "Lydia, this is not a game." "Do you think I believe it is she shot back?" Her voice raw with emotion. "I am the reason those men are out there. I am the one they are hunting. If I cannot help defend myself, then I am just a weight you have to carry. I will be a burden that gets you killed." He saw the truth in her words, and the unyielding strength behind them. She was not the same woman he had found hiding under a rock. He sighed, a sound of profound weariness and resignation. "I will teach you," he promised, his voice low. "But not now, not when they are so close. For now, you just need to survive." The promise hung in the air, a new covenant between them. As the fire crackled, he began to speak, his voice quiet, telling her the rest of the story he had started in the cabin. He told her about the argument over a water right, the hot words that led to foolish pride and drawn pistols. He spoke of the flash, the bang, the sight of a man falling in the dust. And he told her of the worst part, the part that haunted his nights. "I went home," he said, his eyes fixed on a point far beyond the cave wall. "I told my wife, Anna, what had happened. I was packing my saddlebags when the posse rode into our yard. I looked out the window. Anna was standing on the porch, holding our son. I saw the look in her eyes, the terror, not for what I had done, but for what they were about to do to me. And I knew that if I stayed to fight, they would burn my home to the ground with my family inside. So I ran. I slipped out the back and I ran. That look on her face, that is what I see every time I close my eyes." He did not tell her that he had learned a year later that a fire had taken the homestead anyway. An accident with a lantern, they said, but he knew, in his gut, it was no accident. Lydia listened, her own heart aching with his. The weight of his grief was a palpable thing in the small cave. When he was done, she shared a piece of her own bruised soul, telling him of the suffocating silence in the parsonage, of the way Silas could use a Bible verse like a whip, leaving wounds no one could see. They sat in the firelight, two fugitives, their separate pasts laid bare, their shared present a fragile, dangerous thing. Sleep, when it came, was a shallow, fitful state. They took turns keeping watch, but exhaustion was a powerful enemy. It was in that gray space between waking and sleeping that the attack came. There was no warning, just the sudden, dry skitter of a dislodged stone near the cave mouth, followed by the scrape of a boot. Cal was awake and moving before the sound had fully registered. He lunged across the small space, grabbing Lydia and pulling her down, rolling with her away from the firelight just as the night exploded with a deafening blast. The bullet that would have hit her slammed into the rock wall where she had been sitting, showering the cave with stone fragments. Two figures filled the entrance, dark silhouettes against the dying moonlight. Muzzle flashes lit their faces for a fraction of a second, revealing hard, bearded men. Cal shoved Lydia hard, sending her scrambling into the deepest shadows at the back of the cave. "Stay down," he roared. He returned fire with his handgun, the smaller caliber weapon barking in response to their rifles. The cave was filled with a cacophony of noise, smoke, and the smell of gunpowder. One of the men grunted and staggered back, clutching his shoulder. The other one charged forward, trying to get past Cal to Lydia. In the swirling chaos, Lydia saw the man closing in. She was cornered, trapped. Cal was wrestling with the first man, trying to keep his rifle from bearing on them. The second man lunged for her. She saw his leering face, his outstretched hand, before he could reach her. Cal slammed him against the wall and fired another shot to drive him back. The two attackers, one wounded, realized they had lost the element of surprise. They retreated, melting back into the darkness from which they had come. The silence that followed was shocking, broken only by the ragged sound of their own breathing. It was over as quickly as it had begun. Cal stood panting, his pistol still held at the ready, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. Then he looked down at his left hand. A thin, dark line of blood was welling from a deep, ragged gash across his forearm. In the melee, a bullet had ricocheted, or one of the men had gotten close with a knife. He did not even know how it had happened. They had survived. The immediate danger had passed. Cal sank to his knees, the adrenaline leaving him weak and shaky. Lydia crawled out from the shadows, her own body trembling uncontrollably. She looked at the blood on his arm, then at his pale, sweat-slicked face. She tore a strip of cloth from the hem of her already ruined skirt and went to him. She gently took his arm and began to clean the wound with water from their skin, her hands surprisingly steady. He watched her, his expression unreadable. When she was done, she looked up and saw a smear of blood on his cheek from a flying rock chip. She reached up with the clean part of the cloth and softly wiped it away. He closed his eyes at her touch, and when he opened them, he reached out and took her hand, his fingers closing around hers. They knelt there for a long moment in the ruins of their small sanctuary, the near brush with death a new and unbreakable bond between them. The battle was won, but they both knew, with a cold and absolute certainty, the war was just beginning. There was no victory in survival, only a continuation. The retreat from the cave was a grim, silent march through a hostile world. They were not running anymore. They were moving with a new, terrible purpose. It was Cal who made the decision, his voice a low rasp in the pre-dawn chill as Lydia tended to the gash on his arm. "We go back," he said. Lydia looked up from the makeshift bandage, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Back to the cabin. They will be waiting." "No," he corrected, his gaze distant and hard. "They will be looking, hunting. They think we are rabbits. Bolting from one hole to the next. We are going to stop being rabbits." He looked at her, his eyes holding hers, and she saw the cold fire in them. "The cabin is the only ground I know better than they do. It is solid, defensible. It is our only chance to make a stand." She did not argue. She saw the grim logic in his words. To keep running was to prolong the inevitable. To stand and fight was to seize a sliver of control over their own fate. They traveled back on a high, winding ridge, a brutal path that cost them precious hours but kept them hidden from the slopes below. By late afternoon, they saw it the small, man-made shape nestled in the pines, looking deceptively peaceful. But the peace was an illusion. The mountain was alive with their enemies. Cal had seen the signs of fresh horse track where none should be, the distant flash of sunlight on a rifle barrel. He knew they were closing the net. Among them, he was certain, was Jedediah Stone, the bounty hunter. He had recognized the professional patience in the way they had been tracked, and somewhere with them, driving them on with his righteous fury. Would be Silas. As they stood on the edge of the clearing, a change came over the sky. The gray ceiling of clouds thickened and darkened, and a cold, biting wind began to whip through the trees, carrying the first stinging flakes of snow. A low, distant rumble of thunder echoed off the peaks. The air felt heavy, charged with an impending violence that mirrored their own. Inside the ransacked cabin, the air of violation still hung heavy. Cal went to the heavy wooden chest where he kept his supplies. He pulled out a second-hand gun, smaller than his own, and a box of cartridges. He pressed it into Lydia's hands. The weight of it was shocking, a solid, cold reality. "I promised I would teach you," he said, his voice quiet and intense. "The lesson is going to be short." His hands guided hers, showing her how to hold it, how to release the safety, how to aim. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. This was the tool of men like Cal, of men like Jedediah Stone. It was an instrument of death. But as she looked at Cal's grim, determined face, she understood. It was also an instrument of life. It was the only thing that stood between her and the cage Silas had built for her. Cal put his hands over hers, steadying her aim at a knot in the far wall. His touch was firm, grounding. He leaned in close, his voice a low whisper in her ear, meant only for her. "Do not think about who they are. Do not think about anything but this. This is your life. It belongs to you. Hold on to it." He squeezed her hands gently around the grip. "Hold on to this life." They worked against the fading light and the rising storm. They barred the door with a heavy table and braced the shutters over the single window. Cal took a length of twine and a few empty tin cans, rigging a crude alarm across the main path to the cabin. They piled their meager ammunition on the floor between them. They were a garrison of 2 against an army of ghosts and memories. Night fell, and the storm arrived in earnest. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and heavy. Wet snow began to plaster itself against the walls. In the lulls between gusts, they heard the faint, metallic jangle of the tin cans. They were here. A voice called out, artificially warm and reasonable, barely audible over the wind. "Lydia, this is Silas, your husband. Come out." "My dear, these men are only here to ensure your safety. You have been led astray, but you can be forgiven. Open the door, and we can put this unfortunate business behind us." Lydia flinched, the sound of his voice a physical blow. She looked at Cal. He sat in the shadows, his rifle resting across his knees, his face unmoving. He did not answer. He was a creature of stone. "Lydia, do not be a fool." The voice was sharper now, the veneer of kindness peeling away. "That man in there is a killer. A wanted criminal. He will see you hang alongside him. I am your only salvation." Silence. The only answer was the howl of the wind. The pleading stopped. A moment later, a heavy blow splintered the wood of the front door. Another followed, the sound of a log being used as a battering ram. Cal raised his rifle, not to his shoulder, but to his hip. He waited for the third blow, and as the wood groaned and cracked, he fired. The blast was deafening inside the cabin. A scream from outside told him the bullet had found a home in the log, sending a shower of fist-sized splinters into the faces of the men holding it. The night erupted. Gunfire came from 3 directions at once, slugs thudding into the log walls. One shot shattering the remaining glass in the window, letting in a blast of wind and snow. Cal returned fire. A single, carefully aimed shot at a muzzle flash he saw near the wood pile. A cry of pain answered him. Lydia huddled against the wall, the pistol clutched in her trembling hands. The noise was a physical assault, the smell of gunpowder thick in her throat. This was not a fight. It was chaos. It was madness. She saw a shape move past the broken window, a man trying to get a clear angle. All she could see was Silas's face. All she could feel was the shame of the congregation's eyes on her. Anger, pure and hot, burned through the fear. She raised the pistol, her hands shaking so badly she could barely aim. She did not think. She just fired. The gun bucked in her hand, the sound shockingly loud. The man outside yelled, a sound of surprise as much as pain, and clutched his arm, staggering back into the darkness. She had done it. She had shot a man. The thought barely had time to register before the world tilted again. A single, powerful shot came from a different direction, from the deep shadows of the pines. It was a heavier caliber rifle, professional. The bullet tore through the thin wall of the cabin as if it were paper and slammed into Cal's shoulder. He cried out, a sharp, guttural sound, and the rifle clattered from his suddenly nerveless fingers. He slumped against the wall, his face pale in the flickering firelight, his left arm hanging useless at his side. Lydia saw him fall, and for a heart-stopping moment, panic seized her. He was down. The rock she had leaned on, the wall that had sheltered her, was broken. She was alone. Then his words came back to her, whispered in the quiet before the storm. Do not think. Hold on to this life. Something shifted inside her. The fear was still there, a cold, sick feeling in her stomach, but it was no longer in control. She scrambled across the floor, ignoring the bullets that still thudded into the walls, and picked up her pistol. She crawled to the broken window, peering into the swirling snow. She saw him then. Jedediah Stone. He was reloading, crouched behind a large boulder, thinking he was safe. He was not looking at her. He was looking at Cal. She rested the barrel of the pistol on the splintered window frame to steady her trembling hands. She remembered what Cal had shown her. She lined up the sights on the dark shape of the bounty hunter's shoulder. She did not think. She just squeezed the trigger. The shot was clean. Jedediah screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure agony, and dropped his rifle, clutching a shoulder that had suddenly exploded in pain. He was not dead, but he was out of the fight. The loss of their leader broke the will of the other men. The barrage of gunfire faltered, then stopped. She could hear them shouting to each other in the darkness, their voices filled with panic. One of them ran, a fleeing shadow in the snow. Then another. A single figure remained, standing in the clearing, a dark pillar against the white storm. It was Silas. He raised his face to the cabin, his features twisted with a rage that was almost biblical. "Lydia," he bellowed, his powerful voice cutting through the wind. "You Jezebel! You cannot hide from God's wrath. You will burn for this." Lydia rose to her feet and stood in the shattered doorway of the cabin. She was a wreck, her clothes torn and filthy, her face smudged with soot, her hair a wild tangle. The pistol was still in her hand. She did not raise it. She did not have to. She just stood there, meeting his gaze across the snow-swept ground. Her hand was trembling, but her stare was as solid as the mountain behind her. She did not speak. In the face of her terrible, silent strength, his words, the only weapons he had ever truly possessed, were useless. He saw not the meek, broken wife he had tormented, but a stranger, a woman forged in the fires of his own making. He took a half-step back, his threats dying in his throat. He turned and stumbled away into the storm, a defeated prophet cast out of his own garden. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by the moan of the wind and the soft groan of pain from Cal. The battle was over. The ground outside was littered with the dark shapes of the fallen. Some had fled, but not all. The pure white snow was beginning to cover the ugliness of it all. Lydia went to Cal, helping him to his feet. He was weak, leaning heavily on her as she guided him to the bedroll. She tore more strips from her skirt, her hands now practiced, and began to clean and bind his wound as best she could. It was a bad one, deep and bleeding freely. When she was done, she sat beside him, the now empty pistol resting on the floor. She looked at the devastation around them, the splintered door, the bullet-scarred walls, the cold wind and snow blowing through the broken window. She looked at the man beside her, pale and wounded because of her. She clasped her hands together, not in the practiced piety of her old life, but in a new, desperate prayer. She was not asking for forgiveness. She was asking for the strength to endure what she had become. Cal's good hand found hers in the dim light. His fingers were cold, but his grip was surprisingly strong. He opened his eyes, his breathing shallow. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Tears she had not known she possessed welled in her eyes, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "You saved me first," she sobbed. There was no grand passion, no desperate kiss. There was only the simple, profound truth of their hands clasped together in the ruins of their world. In that moment, Lydia saw her past with a sudden, searing clarity, the silent shame, the endless fear, the belief that she was a sinner in need of redemption. But the woman who had stood in the doorway and faced down a monster was not a sinner. She was a survivor. She stood up and walked to the doorway, letting the cold, clean snow fall on her face. The storm was beginning to break. A faint, watery light was growing in the east. They had lost so much. They were scarred and broken. But they were here. They were alive. And for the first time in her life, she was free. The world was born anew in silence and white. The storm, having spent its fury, had departed, leaving the mountain wrapped in a thick, soundless blanket of snow. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the crackle of a low fire and the shallow, ragged rhythm of Caleb's breathing. For 2 days, he had drifted in a feverish haze, the bullet wound in his shoulder a hot, angry center of pain. In those 2 days, Lydia became his anchor to the world of the living. She moved with a quiet, fierce purpose that left no room for the fear and exhaustion that gnawed at her. She cleaned the wound as he had taught her, her stomach churning at the sight of it, but her hands steady. She used the last of their coffee grounds to pack it, an old tracker's trick he had mumbled to her in a moment of lucidity. She melted snow for water, coaxing him to drink, spooning thin, hot broth between his cracked lips. She sat vigil through the long, silent nights, the pistol never far from her hand, her ears tuned to the slightest sound beyond the whisper of the wind. In his delirium, he spoke names she did not know. Anna, Daniel. He would cry out, his good hand clenching the furs, his body rigid with some unseen terror from his past. In these moments, she would speak to him, her voice low and calm, a steady current in his storm-tossed mind. She would lay a cool, damp cloth on his forehead and tell him he was safe, that he was not alone. She did not know if he heard her, but the act of saying it seemed to strengthen her own resolve. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. He woke to find her asleep in the chair she had dragged beside his bedroll. Her head slumped forward, her face pale and smudged with soot. He watched her for a long time, a deep, aching tenderness rising in his chest. She had saved him. It was as simple and as profound as that. The weeks that followed were a slow, quiet dance of healing. As Cal's strength returned, the roles reversed again. He was still weak, his arm bound tightly to his chest, but his mind was clear. They began to talk, not just of the past, but of the wounds the past had left behind. "The men who died," she said one evening, her voice barely a whisper as she stared into the fire. "I see their faces when I close my eyes. I took a life. Cal." He was silent for a moment, choosing his words with care. "You defended a life? Lydia, yours, mine. They came here to do violence. You met their violence with the will to live. There is no sin in that. The sin is in letting another person's darkness extinguish your own light." He looked at his own scarred hands. "Forgiveness is not for them. It is for you. It is the only way to put down the weight of what you had to do." He spoke of his own weight, the guilt he carried for leaving his family, for believing his absence was a shield when it had only left them vulnerable. "I ran," he said, the words costing him. You stood and fought. You are stronger than I ever was." Lydia began to pour her restless energy into rebuilding the cabin, into making it a home rather than a hideout. She took Cal's axe and, with his one-armed guidance, learned to fell a small pine, her swings awkward at first, then more sure. Together, they fashioned a new, sturdier door from the wood, a barrier not of fear, but of purpose. They patched the bullet holes in the walls with a mixture of mud and dried moss. She built a small, sturdy lean-to for Pilgrim, the horse that had stood patiently through the storm. They were not just repairing the damage. They were claiming the space as their own, putting their own mark on it. He taught her as he worked. He showed her how to properly sight the rifle, how to control her breathing, how to make every shot count. He took her hunting for small game, teaching her the patience of the stalk, the quiet respect for the life she was taking to sustain their own. She learned to ride Pilgrim not with fear, but with a confident ease, the horse responding to the gentle pressure of her knees. She was being reborn in this wild place, shedding the skin of the timid woman she had been. Their intimacy grew not in grand declarations, but in the quiet spaces between the work. One night, she woke from a nightmare, a strangled cry in her throat, the image of a man's leering face from the cave still vivid in her mind. Cal was awake instantly. He did not speak, but simply reached out his good hand and placed it gently on her arm, a silent, comforting pressure that told her she was not alone in the dark. The gesture was enough. She drifted back to sleep, the terror receding. One afternoon, she took out the dress she had worn on the night of her escape, its hem torn and stained from her fall in the meadow. With a needle and thread from her small satchel, she began to mend it. Each stitch was a deliberate, healing act, a closing of a wound. She did not try to hide the repair, but made the stitches neat and strong, a visible scar that told a story of survival. When she was finished, she did not pack the dress away. She hung it on a wooden peg near the door, a quiet and defiant symbol. She was no longer hiding who she was or what she had endured. The world beyond their mountain sanctuary, however, had not forgotten them. The first sign of its intrusion came in the form of an old trapper named Elias Thorne. He appeared at the edge of the clearing one morning, a weathered, wiry man with eyes the color of a winter sky. He did not approach with stealth, but hailed them from a distance, showing his empty hands. Cal met him with a rifle held loosely at his side. They spoke for a long time, their voices too low for Lydia to hear. When Cal returned to the cabin, his face was a grim mask. That was Elias. He said, "He comes up from Redemption to trade furs. He brought news." He paused, his jaw tight. "Silas survived the storm. He is telling everyone you were bewitched, taken by a devil in the mountains. He has put a bounty on your head, not for your return, for your capture. The town is stirring. He is forming a righteous posse to come and bring you back for atonement." The old fear, the one she thought she had conquered, returned with a cold, sickening rush. The image of the town, the accusing eyes, Silas's righteous fury. They were not done with her. "Elias says they are talking about justice," Cal continued, his voice heavy with contempt. "About making an example of you." Lydia and Cal knew they had reached a crossroads. Their fragile peace was shattered. They could not remain in the cabin, waiting for a mob to descend upon them. That night, the argument came. It was not loud or angry, but a tense, quiet battle of wills. "We go deeper into the mountains," Cal said, his voice firm. "North. There are places up there no one would ever find us. We can disappear." Lydia looked at the sturdy door she had helped build, at the neatly stacked firewood, at the mended dress hanging on the wall. She looked at the life they had started to build from the ashes of their old ones. "And live like ghosts for the rest of our lives?" she asked, her voice quiet but strong. "Always looking over our shoulder. Always running. I cannot do that. Cal, I will not." "It is the only way to keep you safe," he insisted, his protective instincts warring with the respect he had for her strength. "No," she said, and there was an unshakable finality in her voice. "Safety is not the same as living. I have spent years being safe in a cage. I am done with cages." She stood up and walked to him, taking his hand. "We have built something here. It is not much, but it is ours, and I will not be driven from it." She looked him in the eye, her gaze clear and unwavering. "If anyone wants to follow, they will have to come through us. I am not running anymore." He looked at her, at the woman who had once trembled at a raised voice, and he saw a strength that humbled him. She was right. To run now would be to lose the very thing they had fought so hard to win. He squeezed her hand, a powerful, answering pressure. He nodded. "Then we will make our stand here." They stood together at the cabin door the next morning, watching the sun rise over the distant peaks. The light spilled across the mountains, a promise of a new day. They had made their decision. They would face what was coming, together. A profound sense of peace settled over them. They had a purpose. They had a home. 2 days later, Elias returned. He walked into the clearing slowly, his face etched with a strange mixture of pity and wonder. "You will not need to make your stand," he said, his voice raspy. "The posse is not coming." He took off his hat, turning it over in his hands. "Reverend Silas is dead. He was riding out at the head of his men yesterday, preaching fire and brimstone from the saddle. His horse spooked at a snake on the trail. Threw him. He landed wrong, broke his neck." Elias looked from Cal to Lydia. "Just like that. One minute he was a prophet of God. The next he was just a body in the dust." The news was so sudden, so mundane, that it did not seem real. There had been no final confrontation, no dramatic battle for justice, just a spooked horse and a patch of bad luck. The great looming shadow that had haunted Lydia's life had been erased not by a heroic act, but by a simple, random accident. Elias tipped his hat and left them, a silent messenger who had delivered their liberation. Lydia and Cal stood on the small porch they had built, the bright morning sun warming their faces. The threat that had defined their lives for so long was gone. A vast, silent, and uncertain future stretched out before them. They did not speak. They did not need to. They simply stood together, side by side, listening to the quiet murmur of the wind in the pines, the silence a testament to everything they had endured, and a promise of everything that was to come. The death of Reverend Silas McAllister was not a thunderclap that shook the mountains, but a quiet, final closing of a book. For Lydia, the news brought not joy or triumph, but a profound and weary release. The ghost that had haunted her was gone, vanquished by the simple, indifferent hand of fate. In the silence that followed, she and Cal began the slow, deliberate work of building a life. Time, on the mountain, was measured not in days or weeks, but in the turning of the seasons. The first spring after the battle was a season of mending, both for the cabin and for their souls. They replaced the last of the bullet-scarred logs and built a new, wide porch where they could sit and watch the sun set. Summer came, hot and dry, and they cleared a small patch of land near the spring. Lydia, whose hands had only known the soft earth of a parsonage flower bed, learned the feel of a spade and the satisfaction of turning rocky soil into neat, promising rows. She planted corn, beans, and squash, tending the small green shoots with a fierce, protective love. Autumn painted the aspens in strokes of brilliant gold, and they worked to prepare for the coming winter, a season they now knew not as an enemy, but as a respected adversary. They built a proper stable for Pilgrim, a snug, 3-sided structure that would shelter him from the worst of the winds. Cal, his shoulder now healed into a landscape of angry, puckered scars, taught her how to hunt deer, and they smoked the meat, hanging it in long strips from the rafters of the cabin. Winter arrived, burying them once more in a world of white. But this time it was not a prison. It was a time of rest, of long nights spent by the fire, the quiet punctuated by the comfortable rhythm of their shared tasks. And then spring returned, a miracle of melting snow and the smell of damp earth. The small garden Lydia had planted the year before came back to life with a startling vigor. They expanded the cabin, adding a new room with a proper window that faced the morning sun. The place began to feel less like a refuge and more like a home. They were not hermits. The mountain, while isolated, was not entirely cut off from the world. Occasionally, a prospector who had lost his way or a trapper following a new line would stumble upon their clearing. The first time it happened, a young man, half-starved and shivering with fever, collapsed at their doorstep. Lydia and Cal had exchanged a look, the old instincts of fear and suspicion flaring for a moment. But they saw not a threat, but a reflection of what they had once been, lost and desperate. They carried him inside, and Lydia nursed him back to health with broth and herbal teas. When he left, his pack full of smoked venison, he asked what they called the place. Cal, without hesitation, had answered, "This is the Rains homestead." The name stuck over time. Their homestead became a quiet legend in the scattered communities at the foot of the mountains. It was known as a place where a traveler in need could find a warm meal, a safe place to rest, and no questions asked. They did not seek this reputation, but they did not turn it away either. Each person they helped was a small act of rebellion against the cruelty of the world they had escaped, a quiet affirmation of the kindness they had found in each other. Once, Elias Thorne brought them a letter. It had been given to him in redemption by a woman who had asked him to deliver it if he was ever up in the Sentinel Peaks. It was from Sarah. Her careful, neat script filled 2 pages, telling Lydia of the changes in the town since the Reverend's death, of the new preacher, a younger, gentler man. She wrote that Lydia was spoken of now in hushed, almost mythical terms, a woman who had vanished into the wilderness and tamed it. The letter was a bridge to a world Lydia no longer belonged to, and she read it with a distant, gentle sadness for the friends she had left behind. The changes in Lydia were as profound as the changing of the seasons. The timid, frightened woman who had fled into the night was a distant memory. She moved with a quiet confidence, her body strong from the hard work of homesteading, her hands capable whether she was holding a needle, a spade, or a rifle. The fear was not entirely gone. It was a scar, like the ones on Cal's shoulder, but it no longer ruled her. She had learned to trust the land, to trust Cal, and, most importantly, to trust the resilient strength she had found within herself. Cal, too, was a different man. The haunted, restless energy of the fugitive had settled into the quiet, watchful calm of a guardian. He had stopped running, not just from the law, but from the ghosts of his past. In building a life with Lydia, in protecting her and teaching her, he had found a new purpose, a redemption that no preacher or judge could ever grant him. The love he felt for her was not a fiery, passionate thing, but a deep, steady current that ran beneath every moment of their lives. It was in the way he watched her work in her garden, the way he brought her the first wildflower of spring, the way he would simply reach out and take her hand as they sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the stars ignite in the vast, dark sky. He had finally found a home, not just in a place, but in a person. One morning, in their second spring on the mountain, Lydia walked out into the cool, bright air. The world felt fresh and new, washed clean by the melting snow. She was wearing the mended dress, the fabric soft from many washings, the neat stitches on the hem a familiar, comforting reminder of her journey. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and damp earth. She saw a patch of wild bluebells growing near the edge of the woods, their color a startling, beautiful splash against the muted tones of the forest floor. She bent down to pick one, a simple, joyful impulse. As she leaned over, the worn drawstring of her skirt came loose, and the hem dipped, brushing against the ground and kicking up a tiny, sunlit puff of dirt that settled on the fabric. It was a small, insignificant moment, but it was a ghost of a memory. a faint echo of that terrible, humiliating fall in the mud. But now, there was no fear, no shame, only the bright sun on her back and the beautiful flower in her hand. Cal came out of the cabin, a steaming tin cup of coffee in his hand. He stopped on the porch and watched her, a slow, warm smile spreading across his face. He saw the flower, the mended dress, the small smudge of dust on the hem. He saw all of it, all of her, the past and the present, the scars and the strength. He walked over to her, his steps silent on the soft ground. She looked up at him, her own face breaking into a smile. He reached out and gently brushed the dust from her skirt, his touch lingering for a moment. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, soft rumble, filled with a love that was as deep and as quiet as the mountain itself. "You are trouble," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "But you are the sweetest trouble I have ever met." She stood up and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. They stood together, looking out at the vast expanse of their world. The sun was climbing higher, its light spilling over the peaks, catching the last remnants of the winter snow and making them sparkle like diamonds. A gentle spring wind whispered through the tall pines, a sound that was no longer lonely, but a promise of all the seasons to come. Their life was not perfect. It was a thing of scars and hard work, of quiet joys and shared sorrows. But it was theirs. They had fought for it. They had built it. And in the heart of the wild, unforgiving West, they had found the one thing they had both been searching for, a love that was as real and as enduring as the mountains themselves. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.